Good evening and welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. 1 year ago, this past Monday, on August 15th, 2021, Taliban forces entered Afghanistan in the capital of Kabul. The Afghan capital of Kabul. The takeover is followed by a 2-week scramble by the U.S. to evacuate thousands of Americans and even more Afghans who supported American efforts during the 20 years of war. During the frantic withdrawal, a bombing killed at least 170 Afghan civilians and 13 U.S. service members. And the deaths and chaos led to criticism of President Biden from Democrats and Republicans. In the wake, President Biden's approval ratings, they took a hit. And a year later, he is still plagued by low ratings. In the meantime, the United Nations says Afghanistan is in the grips of one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And the Taliban has banned girls from attending school beyond the 6th grade. The group has also ordered women to cover up from head to toe in burqas. Joining me to discuss the consequences of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan are Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, and here at the table, Eugene Daniels, White House Correspondent and co-author of Politico's Playbook, and Susan Page, the Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today. Thank you all for being here. Peter, I'm going to start with you. It's a year later. It seems in some ways surreal that it's been already a year, but a year later from this withdrawal, President Biden is still in some ways trying to recover from what happened during that frantic time. What are you hearing from your sources about how President Biden views this anniversary and how the White House sees this?
Well, I think that they're obviously been wary of this anniversary coming up for a long time. As you rightly point out, it was a bad moment for not just Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan, but obviously for President Biden and his administration. It gave the impression of somebody who wasn't able to manage things in a competent way after he had promised that that was going to be his strong point as a new president. So I think that this is something they've been wary of for a while. The advantage they have is having just launched the operation that killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, who, of course, was the head of al-Qaeda. And their argument is they show that they don't need a large troop presence on the ground in order to go after somebody who is as dangerous as Zawahiri was, and that they could take him out from the air with a drone without having to have the kind of 20-year war that we've been having with ground troops. The flip side, of course, is that shows the Taliban was once again willing to harbor people like Zawahiri and people who otherwise have America's, as its target. And I think that there's a concern that we see a year later that Afghanistan looks today not that different than it did on September 10th, 2001, before the attacks that caused the United States to go in the first place, that they are in fact repressing their own people, that they are in fact particularly repressing girls and women, that they are in fact a haven potentially for people who have America as a target. So I think that that's it's not a moment that President Biden is interested in celebrating. They are arguing that they made the right decision, and they don't. I think many Americans are happy to be out of Afghanistan. That's the argument they're going to take into the fall.
And Peter, I should just ask you a quick follow-up. I was going to ask you about sort of the killing of that leader of al-Qaeda. What are you hearing from sources about how concerned people are that there could be terrorism and terrorists having safe havens in Afghanistan now?
Yeah, look, my colleagues did a good story the other day about the intelligence assessment suggesting that al-Qaeda has not reconstituted itself in Afghanistan in a fulsome way. But it's a big place with very loose governance, even under the best of circumstances. And what you can see there is the potential for groups like al-Qaeda, if not al-Qaeda itself, to find havens, where they're able to operate without detection or without, strong counter moves by the United States, which is still struggling to create this over-the-horizon, as they call it, strategy, where they can still project power without being on the ground. So I think there's a lot of concern about where Afghanistan is heading and whether we're going to be finding ourselves, focused once again on Afghanistan as a place that poses a threat to the United States or not.
Mm. And Susan, you told our producers the botched withdrawal of Afghanistan was one of the most serious missteps in terms of political impact of the entire Biden presidency. Talk a bit more about why you see this as such a serious misstep.
I think it is the most devastating moment politically for the Biden White House, because he had been elected on a promise of being very experienced on foreign policy from his record as being vice president, being a U.S. senator for so long on the Foreign Relations Committee. And he instituted a policy that people supported. Americans thought it was time for the war in Afghanistan to be over. Donald Trump proposed ending the war in Afghanistan. But the withdrawal, the operation looked so incompetent. It was at such odds with the promise of competence and skill that he had campaigned on. And it left Americans feeling like this 20-year war, America's longest war, we left people behind who had stood up with us. We paid a terrible cost in terms of lives and treasure, and for what?
And for what is a key thing to think about, and something that, frankly, a lot of Americans were asking last year and now this year. Eugene, jump in here. I want to read something that Politico, of course, your outlet, reported. They said, for Joe Biden, the anniversary also marks the moment his presidency started to spiral out of control. Political rights, a spiral from which he still hasn't completely recovered. So what have you seen in your reporting, and talk a bit more about Politico's findings here?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at his polling, right, he, before Afghanistan, they had passed the Recovery Act, giving people checks and shots in arms. The infrastructure package had been passed. And so when Afghanistan happened, they were on a high, this administration. And they pull out, and immediately you start to see that people said, just like Susan just said, that he looks incompetent. This is a man who promised us that things weren't going to feel chaotic. And there was nothing more chaotic than watching planes take off and people falling out of the wheels on one of those first days when the Americans were leaving that country. And the thing that has happened for this administration, looking back, this anniversary this week, no one really talked about it, right? We're talking about it now, but because of Donald Trump and kind of the cloud that he put over the political world, they kind of dodged a bullet when it comes to the conversation. But it does not mean that that is not a part of his legacy. What is left there now, the dire straits that people are, that Peter laid out in that country right now, that isn't going anywhere. And part of that people are going to always feel had to do with how Joe Biden pulled the country out. And we were just talking, when you asked him, is this going to be like the fall of Saigon during the Vietnam War? And he said no, and it looked exactly like that. And so it seemed like they didn't plan for it, and they didn't plan for what the Taliban was going to do after. But they are, this week and the week before, they have been saying, we've proven that we can do what we need to do by not being there. The American people are behind us. And frankly, when it comes to foreign policy, if American lives are not on the line, Americans typically don't care that much about it.
Yeah. And Peter, it was a striking thing that followed President Biden for a long time when he told me in a press conference that this was not going to look like Vietnam. I wonder if you could put it in context here, because as Susan rightly points out, it was President Trump who made the promise to leave Afghanistan. It was President Biden who decided to keep that promise. How does this fall, do you think, when you think about other presidents and the wars that America has fought?
Yeah, I mean, it's right up there. I think Susan and Eugene have this right. I think that, when you write the history of the Biden presidency, that will be a very dark chapter. And there are two questions, right? Was the policy right in the first place? Was it right to get out? And that was something that President Trump had agreed on with the Taliban. He negotiated this agreement with the Taliban, and President Biden then carried it out. Then there's the question of how you carried it out. And you hear that former President Trump and his people say, oh my gosh, how terrible it was, without mentioning, of course, that they were the ones who wanted to do the exact same thing. And it's very likely to have, resulted in the same kind of outcome, with the Taliban once again taking control and the country once again falling into a dark period of repression and tyranny. But it also has the lingering effects, I think, on the presidency of President Biden as well, because for all the reasons Susan and Eugene just talked about, it made him look like he didn't know what he was doing, and it then extended, I think, to other things. So when he didn't get the legislation he wanted to get through Congress, like voting rights, like a stronger gun bill, like originally the Build Back Better Act, which is supposed to be far more expansive than what he eventually got, it looked like he didn't know what he was doing, or he couldn't manage to accomplish what he said he was going to accomplish. The last few weeks have been good for them. They now begin to sort of purge that a little bit, but it's taken a huge toll, I think, on his presidency over the last year, and it may take a little while longer to recover from that if he ever can.
And Peter, of course, we have to talk about the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and women who are now being restricted from going to school, from what they can wear. What do you make of sort of what's been left in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that's exactly right. It's important to remember that the people of Afghanistan were told it's okay now. you're free now. We're there for you. You can come out and take your burqas off if you're women. You can go to school. You can have jobs. You can participate in society. And this is not going to be like it used to be. And now it's right back to the way it used to be. For all the promises the Taliban made of being a new, more advanced, less, more moderate, less extreme version of themselves, they seem to be pretty close to the same version that they were before. And so a question is always going to become, what is our responsibility there? Is our responsibility to continue to stay there in order to fulfill the dream that we helped inculcate among Afghans, or is it really their issue that they have to deal with? A lot of Americans would say that's their problem at this point, and it's not really ours. And I think that's the real tension point in that decision, even aside from the way it was carried out, whether it was whether we've let them down and lived up to the promises that we had made, or whether in fact it's time for us to say, okay, we did everything we could. It's time for them to take over.
And Susan, last question to you. Talk about what the women are facing in Afghanistan, what the people of Afghanistan are facing, and what responsibility to take it from Peter here. What responsibility does the U.S. have to that?
So that moment of hope, when you saw women and girls have opportunities in Afghanistan that they had never had. And that has now been pretty much extinguished. Now there's a dilemma in even, people in Afghanistan are in pretty dire straits, even in terms of having adequate food to eat. A dilemma on whether you offer aid to feed people who are hungry, or do you worry that offering that aid bolsters a regime that you find unacceptable? So we're left with just a world of hurt and hard choices when it comes to Afghanistan. But politically speaking, there is no appetite in the United States for getting back into Afghanistan in a big way, rebuilding Afghanistan. I mean, there is a sense that we did not achieve what we said we were going to achieve, but we put in 20 years there, and it's going to be a long time before Americans are willing to invest, I think, again in Afghanistan in a big way.
Well, that's right. And I think a world of hurt and hard choices is an apt way to put it. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night from Washington.